Tantor Audio presents The Venetians, A New History, From Marco Polo to Casanova, by Paul Strathern, narrated by Derek Perkins. Prologue. In the words of the renowned historian John Julius Norwich, one of the most intractable problems with which the historian of Venice has to contend is that which stems from the instinctive horror, amounting at times to a phobia, shown by the Republic to the faintest suggestion of the cult of personality. Indeed, he goes on to say, it is hard to find much human interest in the decrees and deliberations of the faceless Council of Ten. My intention is not to write another history of Venice, but to show that, despite pursuing this policy, the city not only produced, and attracted to its shores, a succession of outstanding characters, but also that these characters, ranging from Marco Polo to Casanova, often embodied the spirit of Venice, which, in its turn, frequently took on a distinctly individual character of its own. They will be described against the background of events that over the centuries forged and finally destroyed the most powerful of all Mediterranean cities. Venice came to see itself as La Serenissima, the most serene republic, yet here its self-identification was as faulty as its attempt to suppress all individuality. Far from being so tranquil and clearly aloof from everyday concerns, its behavior could be dark and obfuscating, proud and avaricious, efficient or incompetent, devious, vengeful, glorious even, and certainly, towards the end, eaten away by a self-destructive paranoia so embodied by that very Council of Ten, the Committee of Public Safety, Spies, and Secret Police. The Venetians, like the British, were a sea-going island race, who laid claim to an extensive empire out of all proportion to the size of their homeland, whose influence at times extended to the reaches of the known globe. Yet, like America, Venice's empire was more concerned with trade domination than with actual territorial possession. And, like both empires, it was not afraid of isolationism, of turning its back on the large landmass that began just across the water, or of ignoring the larger continental worlds beyond, in the form of Europe, America, and Asia. Venice was ruled over by a Doge, an elected position held for life, whose holder initially held great power, which was gradually diminished over the centuries until he became little more than a figurehead, his sovereignty similar to that of the British monarch today. Although nominally a democratic republic, Venice was in reality an oligarchy ruled by an extensive class of wealthy, noble families. Only members of these families could sit on the parliamentary-style Great Council and vote, a jealously guarded right handed down from generation to generation, and they alone could be elected to senior administrative positions, such as membership of the many interlocking councils that ensured the checks and balances of ordered daily governance, or become members of the Supreme Council of Ten, or become Doge. We have much to learn from the historical parade of varied characters who so reflected Venice's rise and long, long decline. Venice was a city-state like no other, in that it was surrounded by no extensive rural hinterland. In consequence, it was forced to rely upon entrepreneurial trade and ingenuity, essentially individual characteristics. This meant that the city developed several of the traits of an industrial revolution some centuries before the actual industrial revolution began in 18th-century Britain. In the great shipbuilding yard at the Arsenale, Venice pioneered the manufacturing technology of the assembly line, and its glass manufacturing factories on the island of Murano saw the beginnings of industrial urbanization. In order to facilitate their import and export business, the Venetians all but invented banking, established much of the mechanism of overseas trade, bills of lading, and so forth, and made financial manipulation an art of their own. At the same time, it is hardly by chance that this urban concentration of skills and imaginative thinking not only pioneered printing in Italy, but also nurtured some of the finest artists, musicians, and scientists that Europe had seen. Venice nurtured genius and wastrel alike, inspiring tragedy, triumph, and all in between, forever reflecting on itself in the mirror of its own enclosed lagoon. Yet this was also the city whose ambitions, as it approached its zenith, drove its citizens to seek out the furthest ends of the earth. Part 1. Expansion. Chapter 1. Il Milione. In 1295, Marco Polo, accompanied by his father and his uncle, arrived back in Venice, having travelled from the Polar Sea to Java, from Zanzibar to Japan. According to the man to whom Polo would one day dictate the story of his travels, "From the time when our Lord formed Adam, our first parent, with his hands, down to this day, there has been no man, Christian or pagan, Tartar or Indian, or of any race whatsoever, who has known or explored so many of the various parts of the world and of its great wonders as this same Messer Marco Polo." There is no reason to doubt this claim. Marco had left Venice at the age of 17 and had been away travelling for 24 years. By the time he returned to Venice, he was unrecognizable. Just over 2 centuries later, the scholar Giovanni Battista Ramuzio, drawing on stories passed down from father to son by Venetian families who were close to the Polos, described their appearance on their return. They looked just like Tartars, and they even spoke with an odd accent, having all but forgotten how to speak in the Venetian tongue. In 1295, the Republic of Venice was more than 8 centuries old, and the Council of 10 had over the years imposed very precise sumptuary laws, prescribing for its citizens appropriate dress for different classes, commending modest attire, decreeing short hair, and prohibiting extravagant or colourful clothes, except on special occasions. But Venice was also a busy port, and its citizens would have been accustomed to seeing visitors in rather more exotic attire than their own, ranging from mainland farmers in their traditional peasant dress, their dark faces all but obscured beneath wide-brimmed straw hats, to Arab merchants wearing turbans and jalabas, Slavs and Albanians in tribal baggy trousers, and local Jews in their long, dark gabardine cloaks. Even so, the long hair and long beards of the returning Polos, with their weather-beaten skin deeply tanned and wrinkled by long exposure to tropical sun and desert winds, together with their heavy, tattered caftans, which appeared more like carpets than civilized Venetian cloth, must have stood out. Heads would have turned as they walked from the landing stage across the rickety old wooden Rialto bridge and through the narrow alleyways of the Castello district to the Ca' Polo, the family mansion, where no one at the gate even recognized them. The Polos were a minor family of the ruling patrician class, and their fluctuating commercial fortunes had driven them eventually to undertake the bold and ambitious trading journey into the unknown Orient. In Venice, unlike the kingdoms and dukedoms of the rest of Europe, upper-class families were deeply involved in trade. This was the ethos of the mercantile republic. The late 13th century marked an age of expanding Venetian enterprise. Spurred on by competition with their Genoese rivals, Venetian explorers began searching out new markets by sea as well as by land. The Polo family was the embodiment of this adventurous spirit. Upon their arrival back in Venice, however, word soon spread that the Polos had been reduced to rags, that after 24 years of trading they had returned with no more than a Tartar slave bearing a trunk containing their few remaining possessions. As a result, the good name of the Polo family, long respected for their business acumen, suffered severe damage. Without a sound reputation, ventures now undertaken by any of the Polos were liable to attract few, if any, backers or investors. If such rumours were allowed to spread, the family faced the prospect of ruin. In order to restore their good name, soon after their return, the Polos decided to throw a banquet, inviting all members of their family and including as many influential people as they knew. When the guests were seated, Marco Polo, together with his father Niccolò and uncle Maffeo, appeared before the company dressed in flowing robes of the finest silk. They then proceeded to remove these garments, and began tearing them into strips, distributing the colourful tatters amongst the servants, before retiring and returning in yet more fine robes, this time made of red velvet. In the midst of the meal, the Polos rose once more, and began tearing their expensive robes into strips, again distributing these amongst the servants. They then retired and returned once more, clad in the finest robes. At the end of the meal, these too were torn to shreds and given away. By now, all understood. The Polos could hardly be poor if they could afford such extravagant gestures. But Marco, Niccolò, and Maffeo had one more sensational demonstration, which was to be the finale of their performance. They returned clad in the ragged Mongol attire they had worn on their return to Venice. Ramuzio describes how the three of them produced knives and began cutting through the inner seams of their thick garments, causing a cascade of precious gems to spill out. These rubies, sapphires, carbuncles, diamonds, and emeralds had all been concealed within the garments in such a cunning fashion that no one could have guessed what they contained. This story has the flavour of an Oriental tale, and could indeed be straight out of Scheherazade, though Polo's biographer Lawrence Bergreen is of the opinion that here Ramuzio was probably embellishing, but not inventing. At any rate, this or some similar act certainly seemed to restore the Polo name as successful traders. However, as we now know with the benefit of hindsight, the three Polos were indeed enacting something of an Oriental charade, for they were withholding a disastrous secret. They may have returned with a stock of precious gems, but they had in fact been robbed of the major fortune they had made in the course of their 24 years of trading. During their travels throughout the Mongol Empire, their safety and that of their goods had been under the protection of the Mongol Emperor, Kublai Khan, who had taken them into his service and issued them with a paisa, a privileged diplomatic pass. This consisted of a gold tablet, 1 foot long and 3 inches wide, on which was inscribed, "By the power of eternal heaven, holy be the great Khan's name. Anyone not giving reverence to the bearer of this evidence of the Khan's power will be slain." This had guaranteed them complete protection and gracious hospitality on all their travels. However, towards the end of their voyage home they had arrived at the empire of Trebizond, a remote Byzantine outpost on the southeastern Black Sea coast. Here for the first time they were venturing outside the Pax Mongolica, beyond the western jurisdiction of the Khan's paisa. Trebizond was nominally a Christian ally of Venice, but its very remoteness, some 500 miles east of Constantinople, meant that it was to all intents and purposes a law unto itself. When the Polos had arrived here, instead of receiving a welcome from their fellow Europeans, they had watched powerless as their trunks of gold had been confiscated by corrupt local authorities. The sum of their losses would seem to have represented a considerable fortune, and might even have been enough to elevate the Polos to a place amongst the richer noble families of Venice, had they retained it. Needless to say, Marco glossed over the distressing events at Trebizond in his account of his travels, and neither his father nor his uncle ever made mention of their huge loss. Not until after the death of Uncle Maffeo was reference to this incident found in his will, when accounting for the paucity of inheritance and certain debts that the family owed. The loss of this fortune probably also accounts for the three Polos arriving back in Venice dressed in such outlandish garb. They could easily have purchased more suitable Venetian clothing when they passed through Constantinople, which had a large, established Venetian trading community. Yet, at the time they arrived there, the Polos would have been decidedly short of spending money, as well as being wary of risking the secret of their Mongol clothing by exchanging jewellery. Apart from this episode, Marco Polo soon began regaling all who would listen with tales of his travels in the East, including exotic descriptions of China and Kubla Khan. Ramusio described how. He kept repeating these stories, always emphasizing the magnificence of the great Khan, claiming that his revenue was between 10 and 15 millions in gold. Likewise, when speaking of the fabulous nature of the other countries he visited, he always spoke in terms of millions. As a result, he soon acquired the nickname Messer Marco Milione, and was even mentioned in the records under this name, while his house became known as the Corte Milione. And the name persists to this day, having been given to the remaining arches of the Ca' Polo that can still be seen on the facade of the Teatro Malibran in the midst of the Castello district of Venice. By now, Genoa posed a serious threat to the expansion of Venetian trade, especially in the eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and the Black Sea. On his return journey from the Orient, Polo himself was surprised to notice as he passed along the shores of the Caspian Sea how Genoese merchants have taken to launching ships on this sea and sailing on it. Already the Genoese had well-established colonies and trading partners at points all around the coast of the Black Sea. Now they appeared to be expanding far beyond the confines of Europe. Indeed, Genoese influence in Trebizond may even have played a part in the seizure of the Polo's treasure. In 1296, just a year after the Polos had passed through Constantinople, the Genoese launched an attack on the Venetian colony there, seizing all its assets and putting its traders to the sword. The Genoese trading colony in Constantinople would soon be accruing a massive revenue, 3 times greater than the entire income arriving at the capital city from all over the Byzantine Empire. The sacking of the Venetian colony in Constantinople set the stage for outright war. After a number of increasingly serious skirmishes between ships of the two rivals, in August 1298 news reached Venice that a Genoese fleet of 88 ships, under the command of Admiral Lamba Doria, was stationed at the entrance to the Adriatic, posing a direct threat to Venice's trading routes. Doria was keen to draw out the Venetian fleet and engage them in battle, but for some reason the Venetians refused to be drawn. Doria, mindful of his reputation as the greatest naval tactician of his age, suspected that the Venetians were afraid of him. In an attempt at further provocation, he decided to sail into the Adriatic itself, a move that finally forced the Venetians into action. In the heat of the last days of August, a fleet of 96 Venetian galleys, including one under the command of the 44-year-old Marco Polo, disembarked from Venice, led by Admiral Andrea Dandolo. On assembling outside the lagoon, the fleet began rowing and sailing its way down past the islands of the Dalmatian coast. Impatiently awaiting the appearance of the enemy, the Genoese fleet anchored 300 miles south, in the lee of the Venetian island of Curzula, modern Korčula. Here a sudden storm blew up, sinking 6 of their ships. Exasperated by this development, Doria ordered Genoese forces ashore, where they proceeded to inflict rape and pillage on the local settlements, a move intended to draw the Venetians to the scene as soon as possible. While the Genoese waited, a calm descended, and banks of mist began to drift over the glassy sea. Early on the morning of the 6th of September, the sharp black prows of the Venetian galleys appeared out of the mist, as if ready for battle. Then, for no accountable reason, they disappeared back into the mist once more. Doria suspected that the Venetians, despite their superior numbers, were still afraid of taking on the might of the Genoese fleet. But this was not the case. Dandolo had been informed of the position of the Genoese fleet by boats in flight from Curzula, and now sailed to the other side of the island. Here he put ashore a contingent of soldiers who covertly began making their way over the barren, rocky mountains to the far shore. On the morning of Sunday the 8th of September, in a coordinated attack, the Venetian soldiers stormed the Genoese encampment, while the Venetian fleet rounded the island on a following wind and launched into the Genoese galleys. Owing to the element of surprise, the Venetians were able to gain the upper hand, ramming and setting on fire a number of Genoese galleys. On land, a hail of Venetian arrows rained on the Genoese camp, and the Venetians charged. At sea, Dandolo managed to capture 10 Genoese galleys, but in the midst of this operation a number of his own galleys ran aground in shallow water. Doria immediately seized upon this mishap. As the sea battle continued, he surreptitiously manoeuvred the Genoese ships around the Venetian galleys, until at last he had them surrounded. As Doria began forcing the Venetian galleys into an ever tighter concentration, rendering them unable to manoeuvre, the Genoese began firing burning arrows into their midst. Fire began to spread through the Venetian fleet, yet still they continued to fight. However, after almost 9 hours of continuous fighting, the Genoese finally overwhelmed the Venetian fleet, eventually capturing or destroying 84 of their original 96 galleys, and taking prisoner no fewer than 8,000 men. This represented a staggering blow to Venice's ability to fight. At the time, the entire population of the city was just under 100,000, and these prisoners accounted for almost 1/3 of the able-bodied male population of the city. Faced with the prospect of disgrace and capture by the Genoese, the humiliated Dandolo took his fate into his own hands. It is said that he gave orders that he be lashed to his flagship's mast, and then proceeded to smash his head against it until his skull split open. However, his defeat had not been quite as devastating as he perhaps imagined. Dandolo's fleet had managed to inflict sufficient damage on the galleys under Doria's command that the Genoese admiral decided not to risk consolidating his victory by sailing to attack Venice itself. Amongst the Venetians taken prisoner was Marco Polo. Since returning to Venice, he had continued to trade, and had done so with such success that he soon had sufficient funds to sponsor the building and equipping of a galley, which he himself captained in the campaign. Along with his thousands of fellow captives, Marco Polo was now transported back to Genoa in triumph aboard the captured galleys. Within a month of the battle, he found himself confined inside the grim Palazzo di San Giorgio. Adding insult to injury, this prison had been constructed out of stones taken more than 30 years previously from the sacked Venetian embassy in Constantinople. Polo and his fellow Venetians now faced the prospect of being confined for many years. In the manner of the period, the prisoners were allowed to range freely within the castle, and nobles, such as Commander Marco Polo, were permitted large cells that could be decorated with furniture, carpets, bed hangings, and so forth, sent from home. Although many of the poorer ordinary sailors were all but starving, the nobles were permitted to purchase extra rations to ensure their survival. As the months passed, Marco Polo reverted to character, keeping his fellow prisoners entertained with the fabulous tales of his travels through the East. Word of the exploits of Il Milione began to spread through Genoa, and, according to Ramuzio, he was visited by the most noble gentlemen of the city, who bestowed upon him presents to alleviate his confinement. Polo now attracted the attention of another prisoner, who had already been in San Giorgio for 14 years by the time of Polo's arrival. This was the writer known as Rustichello of Pisa, who had in his day been something of a storyteller himself, having penned numerous tales of courtly love and knightly valour, specializing in Arthurian romances. These latter had earned him such renown that he had been invited by the future King Edward I of England to join his court and entertain him during his crusade to the Holy Land some 25 years earlier. There is some speculation that Rustichello may even have met, or at least heard of, Polo during this period, which coincided with the Polo's outward journey through Palestine. At any rate, Polo and Rustichello were to make an ideal partnership. The compulsive storyteller and the writer of legendary tales would combine to produce what would become one of the best-known works in Europe. This might not have been a great work of literature, but its content more than made up for its lack of style. Here was the first description of an exotic civilization whose existence had lain all but unknown on the other side of the world. We were not alone in the universe. Here was another world. Little wonder that an early title given to Polo's work was simply Il Mondo. It is no exaggeration to say that in many ways Polo had visited the future. While for the most part Europe languished in medieval stasis, China had seen the invention of gunpowder, paper money, printing, and the burning of coal as a fuel. According to some sources, Polo brought to Venice in his remaining luggage examples of another Chinese invention, namely ground lenses, which he is said to have used as a form of spectacles to boost his failing eyesight in old age. These could have been used to make a microscope or a telescope, but no mention is made of this, and it would be another 300 years before these instruments were invented in Europe. And besides these innovations, China could also boast such futuristic wonders as Kinsai, the City of Heaven, which in Polo's description sounds almost like a utopian vision of Venice. What he saw was the finest and most splendid city in all the world, filled with wide and spacious waterways. On one side of the city is a lake of crystal-clear fresh water. Its shores are 30 miles long, and are filled with stately palaces and mansions of such splendour that it is impossible to imagine anything more beautiful. These are the abodes of nobles and magnates. At the same time there are also cathedrals and monasteries. The surface of the lake is covered with all manner of barges filled with pleasure-seekers. Once they have finished their work, the people of this city like nothing better than to spend their time enjoying themselves with their womenfolk, or with hired women. Polo describes such hired women in revealing detail. They are found throughout the city, attired in the highest fashion, smelling of sensual fragrances, waited on by attendants, and living in richly decorated accommodation. These ladies are exquisitely practised and accomplished in the use of endearments and caresses, using words perfectly suited to the occasion and the person who is with them. Those who have enjoyed their company remain utterly beside themselves, and so captivated by their delicacy and sweet charms that they can never forget them. As a result, when any foreigner returns home, he boasts that he has been to Kinsai, in other words, to heaven, and can hardly abide the time before he returns. Marco Polo, by then in his early 20s, would seem to have experienced these qualities at first hand. He also describes the delights of the table. China not only had its own entirely original cuisine, but also had foodstuffs such as rice and rice pasta, which were as yet unknown to Europe. In Kinsai, because the fish in its lakes are so well fed, they are plump and delicious. When you see all the different varieties of fish on display in the streets, you wonder how on earth they will all be sold. Yet, in just a few hours, they have all been bought. Because so many of the citizens have grown accustomed to the highest cuisine, they are used to eating both fish and meat at the same meal. Little wonder that so few believed the tales told by Il Milione. Yet, surprisingly, Polo's Kinsai has been identified as modern Hongzhou, and his descriptions would seem to be true, apart from a few minor exaggerations. The lake had a shoreline of 10 rather than 30 miles. His account is confirmed by that of the contemporary Persian historian Vasaf, as well as by the words of a travelling Franciscan friar named Odoric of Pordenone, who passed through Kinsai some 40 years later, and also claimed that it was the greatest city in all the world, and the most noble. There is no denying that Rustichello's written version of Polo's travels contains the occasional exaggeration or even plain falsehood. He was, after all, a romance writer by profession, and as such saw no harm in including entire passages lifted verbatim from his own works. For example, Polo's description of his second meeting with Kubla Khan is recognizable as Rustichello's earlier account of the legendary Tristan's arrival at King Arthur's court at Camelot. Other reasons for questioning the veracity of Polo's account include the very obvious things that he missed out, such as tea drinking, chopsticks.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?